If anybody ever tells you that politics doesn't belong in sports, they clearly have no idea what they're talking about. Sports are inherently political. Sports are a mirror to the society they're played in, so they reflect who gets to participate, who sets the rules, how sport is consumed by others, and on and on. Of course, some levels of sport are far more obviously political than others, and I would hazard in 2026 to claim that there is no greater political sport than football. We are in the midst of the 23rd World Cup, and there has been little shortage of politics in and among the football. I'm your host David, and today we are going to take a more historical look at the biggest tournament on Earth and see the role assumed by the World Cup during the Cold War. In June 1974, the Cold War walked onto a football pitch in Hamburg. On one side, West Germany, capitalist, wealthy, backed by the United States and its allies. They were also the host nation, the reigning European champions, and the squad was full of players whose names are the stuff of football legend. Franz Beckenbauer, Gerd Müller, Paul Breitner. On the other side of the pitch was East Germany, socialist, Soviet-aligned, politically sealed behind the Berlin Wall, and treated by its own government less like a national team and more like a walking propaganda device with cabs. This matchup was not supposed to happen. For years, East German authorities had avoided football matches against West Germany. Not because sport was apolitical. Please, that fairy tale belongs in the same dusty cupboard as FIFA only cares about fair play, and no, I can't accept that briefcase full of money. They avoided football because football was risky. You can engineer success in swimming, weightlifting, gymnastics, and other sports where state planning can turn the human body into a metal factory. But football? Football has weather, referees, weird bounces, panic, deflections, and one exhausted man making one brilliant run at the perfect, or worst, possible time. In other words, football is a state planning's nightmare with grass stains. But at the 1974 World Cup, there was no avoiding it. East and West Germany were drawn into the same group. The two German states, divided after the Second World War and separated by ideology, fences, guards, propaganda, and even a wall, would meet in front of the world. And then the unthinkable happened. East Germany won. Jürgen Sparwasser scored with 12 minutes left, and East Germany beat West Germany 1-0. It remains the only football match ever played between the two German states. The Cold War had a scoreline. But this episode is not really about one match. It's about why the World Cup mattered during the Cold War. Because the World Cup was never just football. It was nationalism with studs and diplomacy with a referee. Think of it like propaganda with a halftime break. This was a global stage where countries performed who they were, who they wanted the world to think they were, and in many cases, what they were desperately trying to hide. Sure, the Cold War was fought through armies, intelligence agencies, proxy wars, nuclear threats, trade deals, coups, cultural diplomacy, and propaganda. But it was also fought through sport. As historians Robert Edelman and Christopher Young argue, sport became one of the major cultural phenomena of the Cold War period. It grew alongside urbanization, television, leisure culture, and mass spectatorship. More states wanted what sport could offer: symbolic capital. Victory mattered because people could see it. They could count it and chant it. They could print it, they could broadcast it, and wave it on a flag. It was bragging rights, soft power with a scoreboard. And the World Cup was uniquely powerful because football was already the world's game. The Olympics mattered, of course. The Olympics were central to the Cold War sport rivalry. But the World Cup did something different. It reached into bars, streets, factories, living rooms, schoolyards, and crowded city squares. It wasn't just elite competition. It was mass emotion because football is a people's game. Since it doesn't need much equipment, it's easy to play. How many of us have played pickup games using some sort of ball and water bottles or jackets as makeshift goalposts? This makes the game accessible, and the World Cup turned national identity into a month-long fever. That made it irresistible to governments, but it also made it dangerous. Sport during the Cold War is sometimes described with George Orwell's line, "War minus the shooting." And yes, that phrase works because international sport absolutely could become a symbolic combat. But scholars of Cold War sport also remind us that sport did more than express conflict. It created contact and built bridges. It made diplomatic encounters possible when official politics were frozen solid. After the Second World War, sport gained new legitimacy as a tool of diplomacy, and organizations like UEFA became some of the rare institutions that crossed the Iron Curtain. So the World Cup was both a battlefield and a meeting place. It was where enemies competed, but also where they had to shake hands. It was where governments tried to control meaning, but fans, players, and the ball itself kept refusing to behave. The scale of the World Cup made that problem even bigger. The tournament began in 1930 with just 13 teams. By the Cold War decades, it had become a global institution as participation expanded. Qualification became more competitive, and newly independent nations entered FIFA and used football to claim a place on the world stage. The World Cup became a kind of symbolic passport, proof that a country existed, mattered, and belonged in the international order. By 1974, 94 countries were involved in qualifying. The tournament also became more technologically powerful. Clemente Angelo Lisi notes that every 1974 World Cup game was broadcast live by satellite for the first time, while commercial partners like Adidas recognized that the tournament had become an increasingly marketable global event. And whether you like commercialization or not, that matters, because once the World Cup became a live global broadcast, it was no longer just a tournament. It was a planetary political stage, and in 1974, that stage was in West Germany. The context was tense from the beginning. The 1972 Munich Olympics had been marked by terrorist violence, and West German organizers didn't want anything similar happening at the World Cup. Security was heavy as police searched airport passengers, and tanks were stationed near runways. And then, as if the tournament needed more geographical seasoning, the draw placed East and West Germany in the same group. This was the kind of thing sports officials liked to pretend was just scheduling. But it wasn't just scheduling, it was the Cold War in football boots. The East German victory created a strange paradox. On paper, it was a propaganda triumph for the socialist state. East Germany had beaten the richer, more famous West. But the meaning was messier than the government wanted. Accounts of the match show how human contact across the Iron Curtain could become politically explosive. After the match, after sitting next to each other on a flight to Dusseldorf, East German player Hans-Jürgen Kreische ended up making a whiskey bet with West German finance minister Hans Appel. To be clear, Kreische was convinced that West Germany would win the tournament, while Appel swore that West Germany, his own country, was too poor to win. So, when West Germany did indeed go on to win the tournament, Appel sent the agreed-upon 5 bottles of whiskey through diplomatic channels. But in East Germany, contact with someone from the West could be dangerous. The Stasi treated the exchange as suspicious. Kreische later learned from his own Stasi file that the whiskey incident helped keep him out of East Germany's 1976 Olympic football team, even though that team went on to win gold. Think about that. A footballer plays in the most politically charged match of his life, and his team wins. He helps create one of East Germany's greatest sporting moments. Then, a few bottles of whiskey, sent because of a friendly bet, became evidence of ideological contamination. The state wanted victory, but it also feared the relationships victory could create. The World Cup could produce propaganda, but it could also produce unsanctioned conversations, shirt swaps, jokes, private admiration, and friendships that did not fit neatly into the official story. And that's the problem with football. You can use it, but you can't fully own it. The 1974 World Cup also revealed another truth. FIFA's supposed neutrality was often political by default. One of the clearest examples came before the tournament, with Chile and the Soviet Union. In September 1973, General Augusto Pinochet led a CIA-backed military coup against Chile's socialist president Salvador Allende, who was found dead soon after. The new junta suspended the constitution, imposed censorship, and repressed the left. Later that same month, Chile and the Soviet Union played to a scoreless draw in Moscow in World Cup qualifying. But the USSR refused to travel to Chile for the second leg because the match was set to be played in the National Stadium, which had been used as a detention center and place of execution following the coup. FIFA went ahead with the match despite the Soviets not being in attendance. The Chileans scored a goal and the final whistle was blown. The Soviet Union was disqualified from World Cup contention, and Chile automatically qualified for the finals. Here again, everyone could say football and politics should be separate, but the sentence collapses the second you look at the actual facts. The Soviet refusal was political. Chile's automatic qualification was political. FIFA's decision to move forward was political. There was no neutral ground. There was only a football pitch with ideology painted under the grass. And then came Argentina. If 1974 showed the World Cup as a Cold War confrontation, 1978 showed the World Cup as authoritarian theater. Argentina hosted the tournament under General Jorge Rafael Videla's military dictatorship. The junta had seized power in 1976, overthrowing Isabel Perón, and launched what has become known as the Dirty War: illegal arrests, torture, murder, disappearances, and terror against suspected opponents of the regime. But for Videla, the World Cup was an opportunity. It wasn't simply a sporting opportunity, it was also a political one. John Spurling writes that Videla hoped the World Cup would unite Argentines under one flag, raise the country's profile abroad, and silence dissent at home. The dictatorship hired the American public relations firm Burson Marsteller to help publicize the tournament. In Rosario, a wall was built along the main road into the city to hide slums from visiting fans and journalists. Shantytowns were bulldozed, residents were moved away from host cities. Operation El Barrido, or the Sweep, accompanied disappearances in the months leading up to the tournament. This is sports washing before the term became part of the modern vocabulary. The junta didn't just host a football tournament, it curated a national hallucination. Argentina was to appear orderly, modern, passionate, unified, and safe. The world would see confetti, stadiums, and flags, and not torture, cells, and disappearances. A country cheering so loudly that perhaps no one would hear the screams from behind the walls. At the opening match, Videla spoke of harmony and friendship. The junta promised a World Cup of peace. Henry Kissinger appeared as a guest speaker. Free flags were distributed in the streets, and fans filled the stadiums with paper, noise, and desperate feeling. And this is what made the 1978 World Cup so disturbing for many. The emotion was real. The dictatorship's propaganda was cynical, but the fans' joy was not necessarily fake. The players' desire to win was not fake. The pride, the release, the tears, the celebrations, the sense that football might give people 1 month of oxygen under a suffocating regime, that was real too. And that's why authoritarian sport is so powerful. It doesn't invent feeling from nothing. It takes genuine emotion and turns it into political camouflage. Spurling records that after Argentina won the final, an estimated 2 million people poured into the streets of Buenos Aires for days of celebration. But beyond the celebration, the facts the regime had tried to hide remained. Torture, disappearances, censorship, murder, and a dictatorship using football as its most beautiful mask. International protest existed. Amnesty International and other groups pressured European teams to boycott. Some players signed petitions against torture. West German defender Paul Breitner refused to travel on political grounds. Sweden's Ronnie Hellström later protested with the Mothers of the Plaza de Mayo. But the mass boycott never came. Business interests, sponsorships, and the lure of the World Cup proved stronger than humanitarian outrage. And that is another ugly Cold War lesson. Sport gives dictatorships legitimacy, and international institutions often help them keep it. FIFA could claim football was above politics, but authoritarian governments understood exactly how political football is. They understood that a tournament could launder an image, distract a population, charm foreign journalists, and transform national suffering into choreographed celebration. And Cold War anti-communism made this easier. Argentina's junta was not some strange exception floating outside the era. It belonged to a wider Cold War world in which anti-communist dictatorships could receive tolerance, support, or polite silence from powerful Western actors because they were seen as useful bulwarks against the left. The World Cup didn't create that system, it just gave it a stage. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union and socialist bloc countries approached international sport from another direction. They treated sport as proof of socialist modernity, discipline, and international prestige. Jenifer Parks shows that Soviet sports administrators worked inside international organizations to build Soviet authority, expand influence, and reshape supposedly bourgeois sports institutions from within. Soviet representatives argued that successful football performances and regular participation in FIFA meetings helped build Soviet authority in the organization. And that matters, because Cold War sport was not only about what happened during matches. It was about who controlled the rules, the federations, the committees, the votes, the referees, the travel, the television, and the language of international legitimacy. To bastardize Clausewitz, sport was diplomacy by other means. And sometimes diplomacy was sport by other means. By the 1980s, the World Cup had become a fully global Cold War spectacle. The 1986 tournament in Mexico gave the world Diego Maradona and his Mano de Dios. Argentina's victory in the famous quarterfinal against England, just 4 years after the Falklands War. That match did not belong neatly to the US-Soviet binary, but that is precisely the point. The Cold War was never only Washington versus Moscow. It was also Latin America, Africa, Asia, decolonization, dictatorships, debt crises, military regimes, nationalist wounds, and post-colonial memory. In the present day, how many people support Team ABE? Anyone but England. The World Cup gathered history and compressed it into 90 minutes, plus injury time. That is why the tournament mattered, and matters internationally. It gave newly independent states visibility, and it gave dictatorships spectacle. It gave superpowers another arena for influence, and it gave divided nations a symbolic battleground. It gave FIFA enormous power while allowing it to pretend that power was merely administrative. And it gave ordinary people something governments could never entirely control: meaning. Because fans do not simply receive propaganda, they interpret it, reshape it, and sometimes turn it against the people who produced it. That is the paradox of Cold War football. Governments loved the World Cup because it gathered the nation in one place. But they feared it for the exact same reason. A stadium could become a theater of unity, but it could also become a pressure cooker. A match could project strength, but could also expose weakness. A player could become a national hero, but also a political liability. A handshake could become a diplomatic gesture. A bottle of whiskey could become a security threat. The World Cup did not pause the Cold War, it just translated it. It turned ideology into choreography, dictatorship into ceremony, and nationalism into song. Fixture lists became diplomacy, and sweat became soft power. Sometimes in the strangest and most human moments, it even turned geopolitical hostility into two men on an airplane making a friendly bet over whiskey. So when we look back at the World Cup during the Cold War, we shouldn't be asking whether politics belonged in football. Politics was already there. It was in the stadium construction and in the broadcast rights. It was in the flags, the anthems, and the qualification disputes. It was in the dictators shaking hands and in the secret police files. It was in the boycotts that happened and the boycotts that didn't happen. The World Cup was never just a game. During the Cold War, it was one of the places where the world explained itself to itself, badly, loudly, beautifully, and often with a suspicious number of men in suits insisting that none of this was political. Sure, the Cold War was fought with missiles, spies, propaganda, coups, proxy wars, and diplomatic summits. But every 4 years, it also put on a jersey, waited in the tunnel, and then walked onto the pitch waiting for the whistle to start the beautiful game. We hope you've enjoyed this episode, and to make sure you don't miss our future work, please make sure you subscribe to our channel and have pressed the bell button, which, when repeatedly asked who it thought was the better footballer, Messi or Ronaldo, just kept saying, Zlatan. Please consider supporting us on Patreon at patreon.com/thecoldwar or through YouTube membership. We can be reached via email at thecoldwarchannel@gmail.com. This is the Cold War Channel, and as we think about the Cold War, please remember that history is shades of gray and rarely black and white.